So the situation in Mali is a little embarrassing for Russia right now. I mean, their Africa Corps was supposed to protect the government, but in the past few days, we've seen their defense minister targeted and killed, Russian forces pulling out of the north, and the Mali capital of Bamako under siege. So to help better understand what's playing out here, we're joined today by Dr. Lesley Anne Warner. Dr. Warner is a visiting scholar with the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and previously served in a ton of roles, to include as the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance at the U.S. Agency for International Development and a Senior Policy Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Dr. Warner published an article yesterday in Just Security discussing some of these issues, and you can find that, as well as some of her other works relevant to the subject, in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Lesley, thank you so much for taking the time. There's a lot happening right now, and looking forward to your insights on everything around Mali.
Happy to be here, especially for a fellow Midwesterner.
There we go. Now we're talking Illinois at heart. So we were able to talk to Caleb Weiss a couple days ago, and he gave us kind of a tactical update on the events that played out in Mali over the weekend, like 3-4 days of pretty significant attacks. What has happened since then? Where does the situation sit today?
So the short answer is the situation's still very much in flux. What was a bit confusing about the initial few days is that the junta leader, Assimi Goïta, was not seen and did not make any public statements until 2 or 3 days after the attacks. He finally came out and had these very orchestrated, carefully curated engagements trying to show people that he's still very much in charge. But the reality is that not only have the recent attacks further undermined the notion of the junta-led security model, the fact that if citizens in Mali and other Alliance of Sahelian states or AES states, if they give up their civil and political liberties, perhaps these military governments can do a better job at security than the civilian governments that they replaced. So that across the board has not really borne out, as data from the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, they just did an update, I think on Monday or Tuesday, shows how the progression of attacks has actually gotten worse under junta-led governments. So to return to what's happened this week further underscores the notion that military-led governments are no better at addressing insecurity across the Sahel, and in fact, they're worse than the civilian governments that they had ousted. This further undermines the notion of, you can have. It further undermines the notion of having Russian-backed security assistance be a regime security mechanism, because I think the most acute risk right now for Assimi Goïta is in internal fissures as a result of his inability to secure the country.
Why was he off grid for a couple days? Was he being targeted? Was he trying to get his message dialed in? It seems like that's the time when a leader would want to be vocal and seen.
Yeah, so I think that the scope and scale of the attacks clearly caught the junta off guard, and the fact that the attacks were able to pierce the inner sanctum of the junta was especially shocking. As you would have gone over in the last session, the defense minister, Sadio Kamara, was killed. That came out, I think, on Sunday, so pretty early into the attacks. There has been speculation that Modibo Kone, who was the intel chief, the head of the National Security Agency, that he was either killed or at least severely wounded. And so you have at least 2 out of the 5 inner circle junta members that seized power, first from civilians in 2020 and then against transitional civilian authorities in 2021. Many of those people were targeted. And so I would assume that Goïta was probably also targeted and was probably trying to keep a low profile, in addition to the fact that he needed to get his messaging straight. Because again, this is all hugely embarrassing and hugely undermining. And I should also mention, there was a officer coup. It's not officer coup. There was a coup attempt back in August that involved the arrest of over 40 military personnel, including 2 generals. So the notion of there being internal fissures that he needs to be very concerned about, especially in the aftermath of these very embarrassing offensives, is something to keep in mind.
Where do the people sit in all of this? Because we've got JNIM, an Al-Qaeda affiliate, not good, bad guys. But then you're talking about a military junta that's taken over the government. Where is the representation for the people? Do they align more with one or the other?
That is a really hard question to answer.
Sure. Yeah.
There's a proverb that says when the elephants fight, the grass suffers, or something like that. Um, I think that the people are very much caught up, unfortunately, in the not only in the inability of the Malian state, not only under civilian leadership prior to 2012, and there's a further history that we could get into, but also under the military-led, the junta-led security that they had from 2020, 2021 on. They're also caught up in the conflict between the state and JNIM, between JNIM and Islamic State Sahel province. So they're very much just caught up in the contestation for authority that is occurring across several fronts, unfortunately. One of the interesting things, just to put an urban lens on this, so after one of the coups, I don't recall which, if it was the one in 2020 that ousted President Ibeka, Ibrahim Boubacar Keita, or the one that ousted the civilian leadership, and Goita was involved in both of those. But after at least one of those coups, there were all of a sudden Russian flags all over Bamako, and people were celebrating. And one could read that as, oh, this is really a anti-Western backlash, and they're really pro-Russia. Or it could be read as there is a vacuum of influence that the Russians very cleverly stepped into and capitalized on that. And I think that I guess what I was trying to say is that there's a false perception that people would be in support of the junta. However, I think we should read that reaction as a dissatisfaction with civilian leadership to provide representative government service delivery, not be involved in corruption, et cetera. So I think that there's a potential to misread a level of support for or against the junta at any given time.
It sounds awful for the people. We haven't heard much in terms of international presence stepping in or trying to take any action to intervene or prop outside of Russia, of course. Do you anticipate that we're going to see that from anyone?
That's a pretty loaded question, and
Unintentionally.
Unintentionally. Well, it's loaded because this junta specifically, they're very focused on national sovereignty and nationalism, despite the fact that they've outsourced their security to the Russians, first to Wagner and then to its successor, Africa Corps. In doing that, in making that decision to switch its allegiance on the security front to Russia, that then created a situation. Sorry, I was about to misspeak. There are two causes to what happened. So one is that by ousting civilian leadership, the junta then was subject to Section 7008 restrictions, which is part of the U.S. legislation, the State and Foreign Operations Bill. And it has said for decades that we are not allowed to provide support to any government that has been unconstitutionally removed another government. And so by having coups in 2012, and then in 2020 and 2021, they were subject to those sorts of restrictions, which then meant that we, the United States, could not provide lethal counterterrorism support. So we had a very robust counterterrorism and counter-violent extremism program, which I had done a study on a little over a decade ago, the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership. And Mali had been, before the 2012 coup, it had been kind of the epicenter of U.S. counterterrorism operations. So the fact that we were no longer able to work with Mali to address their own security issues meant that they had fewer security providers There was also, around the time of the coup, a rise in anti-French sentiment. There was a perception that, despite the French having been there since 2013, they deployed first in Operation Serval to stop the advance of the original jihadi separatist coalition back in 2012. That was AQIM and Ansar Dine and MNLA, which was the predecessor to the FLA, which did this weekend's offensive. Um, anyway, so the French had come in, but they had not necessarily contributed to an improvement of the security environment. I should note, however, that a lot of this, the fault for the deteriorating security environment still rests with the Malian state, and with the decisions they made to prioritize a security-led response as opposed to improving service delivery and improving the presence of the state, and therefore draining the swamp of people who might either actively or passively support an insurgency. So there's sorry this is long-winded, but
No,
there's
it's
the
good.
US element of, the US and French were kind of not perceived as being necessarily very effective, and legally the US was not allowed to provide support. At the same time, you have the rise of people like Goita when he came to power in the 2020 and 2021 coups, who, in the absence of Western presence, or as Western presence was kind of being degraded, the Russians started to make inroads. Mind you, this was not the first inroad for the Russians on the continent. They'd already been in the Central African Republic and in Libya for several years. But given the dynamics of what was happening in Mali, they were able to make inroads there, and Mali was really their beachhead in the Sahel and allowed them to expand to other places. But the presence of Wagner made it difficult for the UN stabilization mission, which had deployed in 2013 around the same time as the original jihadi separatist offensive. It made it very difficult for the UN to operate there. So they were eventually they were severely restricted from movement for 2 to 3 years, and they were eventually asked to leave. So they left in 2023. There had also been a European Union training mission that had deployed in 2013, and they also, because they had difficulty operating, they left, I think, sometime between 2022 and 2024. So the situation we're in right now is essentially Goita has made the bet that the Russians can provide security in a way that all of these Western partners were not necessarily able to. And as we've seen over the weekend, they're actually doing a worse job. So this bet has not necessarily worked out for him.
So what does that mean for the Russian forces that are there? Are you seeing any indication that, I mean, it's very easy to draw the comparison to Syria, I think. Maybe it's sloppy, but you see that as Assad was falling, the Russians just kind of stepped out of the way and said, we're gonna sit this one out. Are they retrograding out of Mali? Do you think they're digging in? Are they maybe going to send more troops? Any ideas there?
I think it's possibly too soon to tell. I think that there's a lot of good work that has been done, including from my colleagues at Carnegie, on the transition from Wagner to Africa Korps and what that meant. And then, so specifically, a lot of this work talks about the fact that Wagner had a more offensive paramilitary operation, whereas Africa Korps was more train and equip, more defensive posture. So very much akin to the Western model that Mali had previously rejected before the various coups. Um, I think that they do not necessarily have the capacity to surge into Mali, just given their other more pressing priorities, namely Ukraine. I think that your point on Russian patrons, Russian partners, I guess, just depending on the nature of the relationship, I think that's a useful one. Just, they were not necessarily able to do anything about us snatching Maduro. That's a bit awkward for them. They've not been able to protect Iran from being targeted by the US and Israel, not only now, but as well as last year. They were not able to protect their presence in Syria under Bashar al-Assad. They were not able to protect their ability to continue operating there under his regime. So given that a lot of those countries may be more important to Russia than Mali would be necessarily. I don't necessarily think they have the capacity to increase their presence. What I have seen in the news is that they have said it seems like they've doubled down and said we're here to stay. There's a big question of to do what. You had one job and you clearly did not do it. So I don't necessarily know that them staying there is going to help secure the country that is now where the capital is now under siege by these attacks.
Yeah, actually, want to get into that real quick. What? The capital is under siege? That feels like it should be a bigger story than it is. So Caleb started to get into this a little bit, but there's like an oil blockade, and now, like, is it actually surrounded by some of these groups?
So that is partially unclear. So let's zoom out for a bit. So back in September, JNIM had instituted a fuel blockade, blocking food and fuel from reaching landlocked Mali. So Mali is bordered by Mali gets some of its imports either from oh, I wish I had my map here, but I believe it was Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire
Here you go. I'm going
was
to pull up a map.
okay. When I'm in my office, I usually have a map where I'm just able to point. So yes, so is right. Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire. So they had instituted a blockade that was essentially strangling Malian cities and causing the price of living to go up. It was causing you just couldn't get your products to market. You couldn't get anything done. There had been reports that in late March, JNIM and the junta had agreed to a truce whereby the junta would release 100 JNIM prisoners in exchange for JNIM letting up on the truce through Eid al-Adha at the end of May. The junta subsequently denied that they actually did this, so this is possibly speculation. However, given the attacks this weekend, it is clear that that was kind of a ruse on the part of JNIM if that truce actually happened. After the offensive this weekend, they have doubled down on their economic sabotage of the junta. I am not in Bamako, so I don't actually know, are they physically, keeping everything from entering the city? But that said, I see this as a continuation of what they had started doing back in September, of just trying to just launch a campaign of economic sabotage and further undermine the junta's legitimacy within the country and just cause the regime to collapse from the inside.
That's correct. I feel like we lose scope of how significant these organizations are if they're blockading a capital city. Just that's significant.
Yeah, it's significant. But that said, I think there's speculation as to, are they going to march into Bamako and what would that look like? JNIM and the separatists do not have, I would assess that they don't have the force strength to hold significant amounts of territory. And so really their focus is institutional attrition and just hoping that it's death by a thousand cuts for the junta and for the model that they espouse. And perhaps that the way that they're targeting and the way that they're managing this campaign, perhaps that leads the junta, or if there's something that succeeds, it leads them to the negotiating table.
Can I ask about a semantic issue here? That's probably not the most important, but I've noticed a lot of organizations referring to everyone that's not the government as the rebels very loosely, and I have a hard time calling any Al-Qaeda group the rebels. I feel like that is not the label I want to use. I heard you just say JNIM and the separatists. Is there any term being used for their consolidated group now, or is it even enough of a group to do something there?
Another loaded question, Preston.
That's all we're doing today.
So I think there's a couple ways I can answer this. So one, I tend to be 20 years ago, I started my career working on insurgency and counterinsurgency. I have always viewed Al-Qaeda as an insurgency. because it has it has the attributes of an insurgency. It has political aims. It uses terrorism as a tactic, et cetera, et cetera. Going to the direct question of using the term rebels collectively, this is the coalition that came together this past weekend is essentially it's a drug deal. It's a marriage of convenience. Um, it is very similar to one that existed for a brief amount of time in late 2011, early 2012, before they. I was going to say they realized they wanted different things, but they always knew they wanted different things. So the Tuareg separatists want a homeland for the Tuareg in northern Mali. Kidal would be the center of that. The jihadists want an Islamic emirate in Mali. Those two things are not necessarily aligned. And so they both want the Malian government, so both the one that existed back in 2012 when they last came together, and the one that exists now, the junta-led one. They want to undermine the legitimacy of that regime, but their end goals are very different, as I mentioned. So one wants a separatist state, secular, one wants Islamic emirate. So I don't necessarily, I don't think it's useful to lump them together as if they're the same, because they've come together for a very specific purpose. I would not be surprised, just depending on how things go within the junta, or if there is any sort of foreign intervention, which it is a bit of a long shot, just given the U.S.-French dynamics, the AES, ECOWAS dynamics with other countries in the region. I would not be surprised if this alliance does not last much longer than it did the last time.
Makes sense. It's a wartime alliance of convenience. Like we see that throughout history, and probably shouldn't attribute more to it than that. Is that a
Yeah.
safe?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a safe bet.
So in wrapping up here, and we are going to link your new article, just came out yesterday in Just Security. Great diving into all of this. You mentioned that there were some openings, some windows of opportunity for Russia to come in and kind of take over the security situation there. Are you seeing that at all in reverse now, where with these attacks playing out, maybe there's a window of opportunity for anyone, be it the United States, France, anyone, to maybe step in the region in general?
So to correct the record, I said it's not a window of opportunity for Russia, because they've been, I mean, they were spanked.
I'm sorry. I think I was thinking back of when when France withdrew, that period of time that opened the door for Wagner is what I was thinking of.
Oh, yeah. I think, no, I can't, no. I think that just given how the extent to which they were undermined, if you can't protect your own defense minister, a defense minister who, by the way, was the architect of Wagner's relationship with Mali. If you can't protect that guy, I don't know what country is necessarily going to sign up for Russian protection. What I did mention in the article is that just some broader context on what Russia had been doing in recent months. So Russia has been trying to, as I mentioned, Russia had a major presence in Wagner had a major presence in Central African Republic, and that was also an instance of in the absence of Western security assistance or Western attention, the Russians swooped in and really made that their one of their lily pads in Africa. But there has been pressure since since there's been a transition from Wagner to Africa Corps. President Touadéra of CAR does not necessarily want Africa Corps because he values Wagner more, because they were the big bad guys. They went on the offensive. Whereas I think he kind of already understood that Africa Corps would not necessarily provide the regime protection that he needed. There had also been reports that after the Gen Z uprisings in Madagascar, when the military hijacked the uprising, the Russians have also made inroads there, talking to the junta leader about providing regime protection. What I would be thinking if I were Twadera, and I'm going to mess this guy's name up, Randranira in Madagascar. If I was them, I'd be looking at these events and I would say, I don't think this is worth it. Whatever you're asking me to give up in exchange for regime protection, you clearly did not do a good job. As I mentioned before, the Russians had one job, and you can't even protect the people that brought you into the country. So why would I want to expand? To pivot off of your question, one of the things I mentioned in the article, and I should say I'm not necessarily in favor of this, but I do think that there is a opening for the United States to get back into the junta's favor. One of the things I'd been tracking, and I wrote about this in World Politics Review in October or November, and I can send you that. I wrote about how the Trump administration was becoming coup curious in the Sahel, and
That's
how
quite the term.
and how they were starting to, because just to back up a bit, one of the uh, complicating things about the way that we manage our relationship with unconstitutional governments is that by cutting off assistance, it's kind of black or white. So either you're with us or you're against us. If you're democratically elected, we can, full steam ahead, we can train and equip, et cetera. If you oust your civilian leadership, you're dead to us, unless you're Egypt, in which case we'll look the other way. But that's, another story. One of the positive things that happened at the end of 2022 in the FY23 State and Foreign Operations bill, there was a amendment to, I think it was an amendment to 7008, where basically instead of it being black and white, it gave the Secretary of State waiver authority. So they could say, it's in the national security interest for this provision to be waived. We can still work with this country. The practical application of that, this was not the intent, but as I earlier in my career, I was a peace and security person. I then became a democracy and governance person. So the democracy and governance part of me says, this is great, because when a country has an unconstitutional change of government, instead of just shutting them off and basically ensuring that they have no other option but to go to someone like Russia, you then have a pathway where you can say, okay, if you take these steps to return to democracy, you have a census, you have an election, you have a interim parliament, whatever it is that returns to constitutional rule. As you turn these things back on, as you check the boxes, or hopefully not check the boxes, as you go through the process of returning to democracy, we can turn things back on. That this waiver authority allows us to do. So just to clarify, though, that is not necessarily the intent, but that is how I think it should be used. So we now have that authority, which is great. So one of the things I've been watching out for is whether the Trump administration would issue a Section 7008 waiver so that the U.S. could reengage with Sahelian countries. I have not seen it come across yet, but that's something I would be watching for. And just broader background on this is back in September, one of the reasons I'd written about this is there was reporting that there had been high-level visits from the State Department, both in the fall and then more recently in February. Both the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa was visiting in the fall. The senior bureau official in charge of the Africa Bureau at State was there. It was in Mali in early February. So they had been talking about possible intel sharing, possible drone overflight, because, as I'd mentioned before, Mali had been the epicenter of our CT operations before we had to pull out as a result of insecurity and the multiple coups. And then it became Niger, but then we had to pull out of Niger because of their coup in mid-2023. So right now, we really have a huge gap in ISR in the region. And so there's clearly a desire to reestablish that sort of presence. And that is made more urgent by the fact that back in the fall, there was a U.S. citizen kidnapped in Niger. And that person is being held by one of these armed groups. And if we don't have...
Still being held?
Yes, I believe so. So that gave an impetus to the Trump administration to discuss discuss intel sharing with these juntas because we're kind of flying blind in this region. All of that said, so I had mentioned all of these indications that we were already going towards possibly revisiting our relationship with these juntas in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The fact that the Russians have been humiliated provides a further opening for us to say, it was the Biden people who sanctioned you and who punished you for having Wagner and cut off your security assistance. But we, the Trump people, are here and we're willing to do business with you. So that, I think, again, it's not something I would necessarily advocate for, but I do think that is a distinct possibility that this creates an opening for the U.S. Not that
it makes sense how you described it. Whether or not it happens, I can see how we get from A to B on that. For sure.
But I should also say, whatever it is that we provide to the Malian junta or whatever succeeds it, is not going to address the root causes of insecurity, because essentially this is and has been a security-led response and not necessarily a governance-led or a service delivery or human security-centric response, which would really address the root causes of the various conflicts.
A lot to take in. But Lesley, thank you so much for taking the time to walk through all this. I'm guilty as well, and I think I speak for a lot of the audience who don't pay a lot of attention to areas like Mali throughout the year, especially with other conflicts going on. So it's great to be able to get your insight when something like this pops up and try to get a little better understanding of what we're watching.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much. All right, so thank you so much to Dr. Warner for taking the time to come on and chat today. This is a lot. It's confusing. I got it. But we're so fortunate to have someone of her caliber taking time out of her day to walk us through what we're seeing, what it means, the historical context, and then what to watch for going forward. Now, for anyone interested in more detail here, you, of course, can find Dr. Warner's works linked in the description below. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.